The prison gate clangs closed behind him, and he takes a deep breath, enjoying the sense of freedom for the first time in 12 years. He has absolutely no intention of going back to that place. But he also feels the rage building inside him. He won't keep it in check, he knows. But this time, there will be no one left to tell the tale. This is True Crime South Africa. I'm Nicole Engelbrecht, and you're listening to episode 151, The Serial Crimes of Chris Nell. This episode is sponsored by the upcoming release movie Mother's Instinct. They call a husband who has lost his wife a widower, and a wife who's lost her husband a widow. But there's no name for the loss of a child, because it's a level of grief no single word can describe. Celine and Alice are living seemingly perfect lives. They both have successful husbands and a young son each. Their bond appears unbreakable. But when tragedy strikes and one experiences the worst loss imaginable, everything unravels before their eyes. Celine, played by Anne Hathaway, and Alice, played by Jessica Chastain, find themselves and their families lost in a whirlpool of grief, guilt, suspicion, and paranoia. Neither seems capable of escaping from. Mother's Instinct opened in cinemas on the 12th of April, and I've got the names of our giveaway competition winners. Jean-Drie Bosman and Marie Fenter. Congratulations. You've each won a set of double tickets to watch Mother's Instinct, and your popcorn and drink are complimentary too. I have no doubt you're going to have an incredible night watching Mother's Instinct. If you weren't lucky enough to win free tickets, hop online and book your tickets now. Mother's Instinct is in cinemas nationwide right now, and it's absolutely nail-biting. A huge thank you to Mother's Instinct for sponsoring this episode of True Crime South Africa. Since 2019, True Crime South Africa has been telling the stories of the victims of violent crime in South Africa. The podcast is independent. That means no big or even little corporates fund it. And that's just the way I like it. And it's the only independent podcast in South Africa that consistently charts in the top 10. Keeping a podcast like this going is time-consuming. And for the most part, it remains a one-woman process. It's me. I'm the one woman. You, yes you, are the reason this podcast continues to flourish and help bring in tips on missing person and cold cases. If you'd like to help keep the show running, please consider supporting our sponsors, signing up to Patreon or PayPal, follow the show on the socials, as the kids say, and share it with your fellow partners in crime. You can find our social links and learn more about our sponsors at True Crime South Africa/donate. Shout out to this week's Patreon and PayPal superstars. A huge thank you goes out to Jean Javon, Vanessa Allen, Robin Furs, and Andani Mapalu for your support on Patreon. Thank you so much, everyone. Patreon supporters get one additional exclusive episode a month, a shout-out on the pod, and other exclusive content, including Q&As with me as and when it's available. It's a minimum of $1 a month. I think you should do it. Please. And thank you. Kia ba. Today's episode is also one that was previously released in the Patreon feed and has been reworked and re-recorded for the main feed this week. It's a serial murder case that never really got much attention when it happened, but as with all crimes and all victims, it's worth remembering and talking about. You'll find that this killer, like so many other serials I've spoken about where sexual motivation is involved, started out with a crime that should have absolutely thrown up a whole range of red flags for serial-like behavior, but these signs were not seen, and he went on to be given the opportunity to progress into a full-blown serial killer. Rape victims are not identified to provide them with the anonymity the law affords. In researching this episode, I used Mickey Pistorius's book, Strangers on the Street, a few academic papers, and some online sources. So, let's get into episode 151, The Serial Crimes of Chris Nell.
The following episode may contain sensitive material, including descriptions of violence, sexual assault, or graphic descriptions of injuries to victims. If you feel you may be triggered by such material, please consider this before accessing our content. To access trauma counseling or services, please see the helpline information on our show notes.
Jan Abraham Christoffel Nell was born in 1966. His father died when Chris was quite young, and his mother remarried soon after. Chris did not get along with his stepfather, and the man's entry into his life brought with it many changes. Chris's stepfather had 2 daughters of his own, and after their marriage, Chris's mother had 2 daughters with the man as well. Chris was soon the oldest in a group of 5 siblings, after having been the only child and the focus of all the attention until his biological father had died. Chris's behavior began to mirror these changes, and he was constantly in trouble. At one point, his mother sent him to boarding school in the hopes that being separated from family life would help him to deal with his issues. This did not work, and Chris constantly ran away from the hostel. Chris's stepfather was a violent man, and his solution to most things was violence. To discipline Chris, he assaulted him with both his fists and a belt. He also regularly physically assaulted Chris's mother. Chris claimed that it was through his stepfather that he learned to be violent to women. He said his stepfather had told him that women needed to know their place in the world or suffer the consequences. When Chris Nell was 16 years old, he told his mother he wanted to go live with his grandmother in Benoni. He was struggling academically due to his behavioral issues and was already 2 years behind his age group in his schooling. His mother's response was that he should go live with his grandmother if he wanted to. At this stage, Chris was repeating grade 9 for the 2nd time, and when he failed yet again, he abandoned his studies and decided to join the army instead in 1983. This seems a strange decision for someone with behavioral issues and problems with authority, but he possibly thought about the army as a space where he may have been able to find something he was good at. That was not to be, unfortunately, and he only managed a year in the army before moving to Postmasberg in the Northern Cape and taking a job as a driver for the railways. This time in Chris's life seemed to have been very lonely. He knew no one in Postmasberg and was unable to make any close friends. He worked shifts, lived in the railway hostel, and spent his free time watching videos almost compulsively. He would watch about 9 a day at one point. At one stage, he'd become close to a young woman in the area, and he considered her his girlfriend. The woman, though, had not felt the same level of seriousness around their relationship that Chris had, and had been seeing other men. When Chris found out, he'd seen this as a significant rejection, and his personal perspective of this seemed to trigger something in him. 3 months after this relationship ended, on the evening of the 3rd of November 1984, Chris attended a disco that was being held at the local showgrounds. He'd spent most of his day drinking and watching videos, but he says he was not intoxicated by the time he arrived at the disco. He got a lift there with a friend, and the young man had asked Chris to hold his car keys for safekeeping. As the night wore on, Chris asked several women to dance with him at the disco, but was turned down by all of them. He would later say that rage began to build up inside him the more he was turned down. Around 11 p.m., he went outside to go to the toilet. He witnessed 2 girls entering the ladies' toilets, and he would later say that he knew the moment he saw them that he was going to kill them. He followed them inside the toilet. 15-year-old Rika Fushia and her 17-year-old friend, who we'll call Miss S, were combing their hair and fixing their makeup in the toilet mirror when they saw Chris Null enter the room behind them. Chris had taken a penknife off his friend's car keys, and he had it in his hand. A quick-thinking Miss S grabbed her friend by the arm and tried to pull her into a cubicle so they could lock themselves in, but Chris was too fast for her. He grabbed Rika and pulled her out of the stall. Miss S had no choice but to lock the door behind her. For the next few minutes, she would have to listen helplessly as Chris Null terrorized her young friend. Chris told Rika to take her clothes off, but the girl refused. Then Miss S heard the pair start to struggle, and a horrific rasping noise emanated from her friend. Then everything was quiet. Ms. S stood on the toilet so that she could look over the door. Chris Null was washing blood from his hands in the basin, and when he saw Ms. S appear over the top of the door, he turned around and smiled at her. Rika Fushia's body lay on the floor of the toilet. She had been stabbed 25 times, and Chris had slit her throat. He'd cut her underwear off with his knife, but he had been unable to rape her. He was not finished, though, and was not prepared to leave Miss S alive. He pulled himself up the wall of the cubicle she was in, and Miss S opened the door in an attempt to escape. She made it out the door, but Chris caught her and dragged her into nearby stables. Ms. S begged Chris not to kill her. He told her that nobody loved him and that he hated all women because they were all the same. He told her about his girlfriend who'd left him for another man. Ms. S responded that his girlfriend must not have loved him if she'd left him. It's likely this was an attempt to calm him down, almost a way to console him or show him that he deserved better, a fawn response, of course, as an alternative to freeze, fight, or flight. But it was unfortunately the worst possible thing she could have said to Chris Null, because he exploded. He tore Miss S's clothes off her and raped her. When the attack was over, the young woman feared that he would now kill her, so she pretended that she was bending down to get her clothing, pushed Chris over, and ran out of the stables. Chris ran after her and tackled her to the ground. Just as they fell, a vehicle started up close by, and the headlights illuminated the pair. Ms. S pulled herself from Chris's grasp and ran toward the car, screaming for help. Chris fled to the stables, where he hid. The police arrived on the scene soon after being called by the couple who had unwittingly saved Miss S. They found Chris Null hiding in the stables. He claimed he'd just seen Miss S running naked on the showgrounds and had tried to stop her so that he could help her. Ms. S had already given her statement to police, though, and identified Chris Null as the man who had murdered Rika and raped her. The bloodied penknife was found on the scene, and Chris's friend admitted it was his, and it had been attached to his car keys when he'd given it to Chris. Major Louis Swanepoel interviewed Chris Null, and he admitted to killing Rika and raping Ms. S. He blamed the intense anger that he had inside him after his girlfriend had dumped him, and he said he felt a great sense of relief after the murder and did not regret killing the girl. 2 years later, in June 1986, Chris Null narrowly escaped the death penalty for his crimes. Judge Basson decided it would be unfair to sentence someone who had been just 18 years old at the time of his crime to death. He stated that he wished to provide Chris with some hope of release and time to rehabilitate himself. Chris Null was sentenced to 20 years for both the murder and attempted rape of Rika Fashier and the rape of Miss S. I don't think there's any doubt that the sentence handed down to Chris Null was woefully inadequate. But I'm also not surprised given the period of time it happened in. Almost all the sentences given out during this period were really low compared to what we might see today. Essentially, if they weren't hanging people, then they were giving them 20 years. It was a little odd, I'll be honest, but it's got a lot to do with the knowledge we have about the criminal mind now that we didn't have then. Regardless of Chris's age, the viciousness of the murder of Rika Fashier and the rape of Miss S would almost definitely have earned him a life sentence today. In all fairness, it was not premeditated, but I do believe a judge with an understanding of psychologically motivated crimes today would have seen the kind of offender sitting in front of him, especially since Null showed absolutely no remorse. Unfortunately, the judge would have no idea that all he was doing was creating a serial murderer. By giving Chris Null a sentence that almost guaranteed his freedom at a very young age and providing no way to address the fact that the man had shown no remorse and clearly had an intense hatred for women, the judge simply wrapped a time bomb up in bubble wrap and put it in a cupboard. The time bomb would not change its nature by being put away. It simply continued to tick, and with each passing year, got closer and closer to exploding again. Chris Null did not even serve the full 20 years he was handed down. In 1997, at 30 years old, after having served just 12 years of his sentence, he was released on parole. He settled in Uppington and was able to find a job as a mechanic at CAY Motors in Rue Street, Uppington. Chris only socialized with his work colleagues and made no friends outside that circle. He also did not date at all. Chris arrived in Uppington in January 1997. His employer would likely have been aware of his past, but the residents of the town had absolutely no idea who was now living in their midst. On the 10th of November 1997, 18-year-old schoolgirl Hermine Maasdorp spent the night at Fantasy nightclub in Rue Street. She left to walk home at 1 a.m. and never made it to the safety of her house. The next day, her body was found in a field on Lutzput Road, which stems off from Rue Street. She was naked, save for her bra, and she'd been beaten with a blunt instrument and raped. Her cause of death was significant head injuries. Forensic testing revealed a small amount of sperm on her body, and it was sent off for DNA typing. Rue Street, in which CAY Motors was based, was a main road in Uppington, and as a result it had also become a gathering point for sex workers at night. A month after Hermine Maasdorp was murdered, 22-year-old Belinda Fasahi was picked up by a prospective client for the purposes of sex work. Belinda's colleagues recognized the man that had picked up their friend. He was a regular, and they knew him as Johan. Johan, of course, was not the man's real name. He was Chris Null. That night, Chris had driven Belinda out to a remote area on Louisville Road, and they engaged in a sex act which had been agreed upon.
He then demanded anal sex from Belinda, and she refused. Chris Nell began to assault the woman, beating her about the head and face with a bottle. During the attack, Belinda managed to get out of the car and flee. She hid in the bushes while Chris stumbled around in the dark, hunting for her. Unable to find his victim, Chris drove away. Belinda was able to flag down a woman driving down the road and get a lift home. Sadly, Belinda Fasaki did not report the attack to police at the time. She likely felt unprotected in a world where she would be viewed as having somehow asked for the attack through the act of being a sex worker. She may not have trusted police and could have thought that she would be arrested if she admitted that Chris Nell had been her client. Belinda did see a doctor for her severe injuries, though, and the doctor carefully documented the extent of the wounds. This report would be extremely useful later on. Chris Nell, who called himself Johan among the local group of sex workers, had become persona non grata with them. They hadn't reported the assault to the police, but word had spread that he was not safe to go with. So on the 18th of March 1998, when Chris Nell pulled over next to a group of women and told 30-year-old Janetta Mankies that he'd like to pay her for sex, her colleagues immediately warned her not to go with him, reminding the woman what he'd done to Belinda. Janetta, unfortunately, caught up in the vicious circle that so often surrounds the sex trade, pushed her friend's warnings aside and got into Chris's car. Janetta Mankies' body was found the next day. She was just 400 meters from the place where Belinda would later testify Chris Nell had assaulted her. Janetta died a horrific death. She was naked when she was found, and her face was caked in sand. There were multiple blunt force injuries on her body. One injury, though, had undoubtedly caused her death when her jawbone was broken, becoming dislodged and blocking her airway. She died of suffocation. When Janetta's body was identified, her co-workers were interviewed, and they immediately identified the man that they knew as Johan as being the last person they knew of to have been with Janetta. Chris Nell may have thought he was using a pseudonym, but he didn't seem to account for the fact that he was driving his employer's branded vehicle. It didn't take long for investigating officer Sergeant Jacques Visser to figure out that Johan was paroled murderer and rapist Chris Nell. Chris Nell was arrested on the 23rd of March 1998 at his place of work for the murder of Janetta Mankies. Sergeant Visser also knew about the as yet unsolved murder of Hermine Maastorp and took blood samples from Chris Nell to compare to the DNA evidence they had in that case. It was a match. Now, emboldened by the man's arrest, Belinda Fasaki came forward with her story and laid a charge of assault against Chris Nell. In July 1999, Chris Nell went on trial for the attempted murder of Belinda Fasaki, the murder and rape of Hermine Maastorp, and the murder and rape of Janetta Mankies. Chris Nell pleaded not guilty to all charges. He claimed that he didn't even know any of the victims and that they had him mixed up with someone else. He had no explanation for the fact that his DNA was found on Hermine Maastorp. On the 28th of July 1999, Chris Nell was found guilty of all charges except the rape of Janetta Mankies. Because Janetta was a sex worker, the judge felt that he could not know for sure whether or not she'd consented to the sex. Hermine Maastorp's father cried softly in the public gallery as his daughter's murderer was handed down a life sentence. In her book, Strangers on the Street, former SAPS profiler Mickey Pistorius says that in her opinion, there is never any hope of a serial murderer being rehabilitated. She does not believe that Chris Nell should ever have been released from prison, and while I certainly agree with her, at the time, he was technically not a serial murderer. I also think that our understanding of sexually motivated crimes was very poor in 1984, and the judge would likely not have understood that there was simply no hope of rehabilitation for an offender like Nell. His complete lack of remorse and the fact that during his prison term his hatred for women only grew, and he was demonstrative about this, should have been an enormous red flag that should have blocked his release. But it didn't, and 2 more women paid with their lives. Unfortunately, it is almost impossible to determine whether Chris Nell is indeed still incarcerated. Post-2004 life sentences in South Africa carry a minimum direct imprisonment period of 25 years before the offender becomes eligible for parole. But because Chris was sentenced in 1999, several judgments passed down between then and 2004 mean that he may have already become eligible for parole, and it's very difficult to know whether or not he's been granted it or not. Although in his last set of crimes, he was determined to be a serial offender, which should be a major red flag for a future parole board, really, his first set of crimes should also be considered in terms of his pattern of behavior. Yes, he served his time, if you want to call it that, for those crimes. But when a parole board is considering releasing an offender, they must consider the totality of the offender's lifelong criminal behavior to ensure they know that the offender is truly rehabilitated. This because Chris Nell has already proven to be difficult to rehabilitate. He was not rehabilitated the first time he was released, despite apparently serving his time, so that should absolutely be taken into account when he is considered again in the future. But one of the failings of our current parole system is that it mainly considers the crimes the offender is currently incarcerated for. I would certainly hope that Chris Nell is still incarcerated for the safety of all South African women. His deep hatred for women doesn't really seem to have a root cause we can actually point to, so in my mind, it would be very difficult to resolve. There are Chris Nells being built every day, though. They are being formed in dysfunctional families, provided with the resources to commit their crimes by a system and a society that still victim blames, and being given the benefit of the doubt by our judicial system. Today, rehabilitation services are available to a far greater extent than they were in 1986. But these offenders are still being released into the same society that caters to their desire for power and dominance over their victims. If Rika Fashia's murder and Ms. S's brutal rape had been seen as enough to warrant a life sentence, 2 more women would not have lost their lives. If Belinda Fasaki had not already felt so broken down by a system that belittled and victimized her daily, she may have reported her assault. So really, Chris Nell wasn't just let out to kill again. He was empowered to kill again. When he was released the first time after just 12 years, he was essentially told that Rika Fashia's life did not matter to society as much as his did. He was told that Miss S's trauma did not matter to society as much as his right to get a second chance. And then we were surprised when he continued to behave as though his needs were more important than everyone else's, when society and our systems just kept confirming that for him. I'm glad that Chris Null didn't get much publicity, and he was never given a moniker that would make people remember him. His name is easy to forget. I think we should do just that. And instead, we remember his victims. Belinda Fasahi and Ms. S., may your lives have been a continued testament to the courage and power you displayed. Rika Fushia, Hermine Marstorp, and Janetta Mankies, rest gently.
If you'd like to hear more victim-focused true crime content, please subscribe to True Crime South Africa on Spotify or the platform you're using to listen right now. If you're looking for something still related to real-life stories, but often with a more positive slant, you can check out my new podcast series, I Lived Through This. You can follow both podcasts on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, thank you for your support, and I'll chat to you soon.